Hello, and welcome to Distant Echoes, New Mexico Episode 30, Spanish Government in New Mexico. Last time we began our discussion of the Bourbon reforms in New Mexico, starting with the creation of the Commandant General and reforms that they made to the military. Today we'll continue that discussion with talking about how the government in New Mexico changed over time. Starting with the lowest level form of law enforcement, you had the judges, with the alcalde mayor, a local official, serving as the first role at the lowest level of judge, and then you'd continue up through the ranks of the government all the way up to the audiencia back in Spain. Appeals were a thing that was possible if you wanted to, but often they were not taken because you still had to pay for a lawyer and travel to these new courts as you worked your way up from the alcalde to the governor to the viceroy to the audiencia back in Spain proper. Furthermore, there was also the difficulty with travel to some of these areas from how remote New Mexico was. There were also fueros, or special courts that existed specifically in conflicts of jurisdiction. Due to the cycle of war and trade in New Mexico, economic development was really slow. We'll talk about that a lot more when we get to our episodes on the Spanish economy in New Mexico during this time period. Furthermore, from Scholes on the governor's authority, quote, "A governor's powers were wide enough to permit an honest and energetic man to maintain discipline and secure justice, or to make it possible for a self-seeking official to become a local tyrant," end quote. And overall, the 1700s would see a decline in the number of subordinates to the governor compared to earlier periods. The reasons for this were twofold. The first reason being the difficulty in finding qualified people in the area. And if you could find qualified people from other parts of the empire, they often did not want to travel to as remote a place as New Mexico. The other reason was the desire among the Spanish crown to cut overall costs in the province. If you have multiple levels of government, multiple officials, each of them needs to be paid. The governor himself would be paid 4,000 pesos annually. Half of his salary for the first year would be taxed in a tax called the media annata, which he had to pay to the crown. But this was only for his civil salary of 2,000 pesos. Starting in the 1790s, 1/5 of his salary every year would be withheld. Considering the cost to maintain yourself in this office, 4,000 pesos was hardly adequate. In the late 1600s and early 1700s, some of the governors would even go so far as to bribe the crown and quite literally purchase their office. From Spanish government in New Mexico, quote, "This represented a considerable initial outlay, and it is clear that the men who thus purchased their offices expected to profit through illegal activities open to them," end quote. In addition to this, the governor was also the military leader, which came with its own stipend of money. Arguably, this was his most important position, and many of the governors of New Mexico would have extensive military experience, especially on the frontier. Until 1768, the governor also had the title of Captain General, but after this date, it was slowly shifted from the viceroy. It did take time for this shift to actually occur. As late as 1777, the governor of New Mexico, Mendinueta, still had this title. The governor had used this title to be able to abuse the systems that were used to provision and quarter presidial troops, allowing him to turn a small profit by basically buying the things that the troops needed at under the cost that they made, and then basically selling it back to them for their salary, basically taking the soldier's entire salary for himself. The governor also had the authority to nominate officers for the military. He was supposed to name 3 names per each vacancy he was trying to fill, but often he had trouble finding 3 people that could be nominated. And this really meant that when that happened, the Commandant General could backfill those missing nominations with his own picks from outside of the province of New Mexico and send them instead, or send one of the ones that the governor had chosen. A judicial inquiry, the residencia, was performed at the end of every term when people from the colony could come forward to the new governor and basically charge the governor with abuses of his office or other crimes. Usually, New Mexican governors were corrupt and abused their power, and colonists had plenty of complaints about them as a result. But when they were found guilty, they often could just bribe the judge to get out of having to face the consequences of their actions. Before the 1700s, the governors also occasionally got licenses that allowed them to leave early, thus escaping the fines entirely. The governor's direct subordinates would also be investigated during the residencia. The governor, in addition to running the military side of things, the governor was also to visit and inspect various places. They usually did this at the beginning of their governorship, and this is when legal cases would be presented by those who could not travel all the way to Santa Fe to have them heard. The governor also had certain authority to appoint clergy and he was also supposed to encourage economic growth. This last one was really difficult due to the lack of natural resources being exploited in New Mexico, as well as the consistent cycle of violence in the province due to raiding. There were also efforts the governor made to keep the population concentrated. At a high level, what the Spanish wanted to do here was they wanted defendable settlements with a large group of population. So basically small population centers that were defensible, that's where the people actually lived, and then they'd go out from those to tend to their land, their herds, whatever it may be. There was lots of resistance to that from the Spanish settlers themselves, but it did see some success, for instance, in places like Chimayo, Abiquiu, and Ojo Caliente. If you wanted to leave the colony, you needed a permit, which the governor had to grant. This was a policy enacted throughout the empire. The governor also had the authority to make land grants, and often he provided land grants for a limited amount of time. Finally, another power he had that I want to talk about is that he had the ability to register cattle brands. So normally the Spanish government charged a fee to register a cattle brand, but in New Mexico, the rate was 1 peso instead of the normal rate of 30 pesos seen in other parts of the empire. This was mostly due to the fact that New Mexico was quite impoverished. There was also the lieutenant governors appointed for special duties by the governor. Starting in the 1660s, when the province was split into 2 districts, the lieutenant governor was usually the one in charge of the Rio Bajo, or southern New Mexico, while the governor maintained being in complete control of northern New Mexico, or the Rio Riba. Later on, the lieutenant governor would be appointed by the viceroy or the commandant general, depending on the time period, and usually pulled from the army officers. His base would also be moved to El Paso around this time. The lieutenant governor also, more often than not, was independent of New Mexico's governor, giving him some leeway in his control. In addition to those 2 offices, the governor often tried to have a secretary, an assessor, and clerks. Often, though, these were missing in the late colonial period. Often, the governor either had to consult people further south in the Mexican core for these services, or he would come up with workarounds. For instance, instead of having notaries, the Spanish government in New Mexico used witnesses. Under the commandant general, the province was a financial liability to the crown all the way until Mexican independence. The friars were one of the bigger drains on the province compared to other areas under the commandant general. From 1776 to 1781, the crown paid 51,264 pesos for the missionaries. This is a little bit less than the 55,000 pesos that New Mexico cost annually. In 1812, it was suggested that they abolish the trade monopolies that the merchants of Chihuahua had over the province to try and help boost prosperity, but that didn't really amount to anything until after independence. The governor himself was in charge of all the budgetary categories for the province, and cash would be deposited in a chest with 3 keys. One of these keys would be held by the governor, one by the supply master, and the third by whatever officer was the highest rank in the province. The theory behind this was that if all 3 people were in charge of the chest, it'd be a lot harder for one of them to be skimming from the top. And if all 3 were colluding to skim from the top, that would be such a large loss of revenue from the chest that it would be noticed. New Mexico itself would end up exempt from most of the taxes. Again, this was to try and promote economic growth. The alcaba, which was a sales tax, was exempt both from the original contract, and this would be extended all the way into the late 18th century. Starting in the late 1700s, though, it would kind of be an on and off again tax. And for all intents and purposes, it was never seriously collected during the colonial period. In addition to this, there were other special taxes called donativos. These were sometimes voluntary, sometimes not, and they were for special causes. Zuni Pueblo would be one of the pueblos that would benefit from one of these donativos, as well as the United States revolutionaries during the American Revolution. In addition to that, some other things that brought in funds for the crown were the gunpowder, tobacco, and playing card monopolies. However, they also had their issues. New Mexicans often made a low-grade tobacco from a local plant called punche. The Spanish crown would try to outlaw punche and all forms of tobacco production in New Mexico, but it proved to not be worth it. Most New Mexicans couldn't afford tobacco and thus would switch over to other sources like mata or other plants that provided a small amount of tobacco. And eventually, the entire area would be exempt from this ban on growing tobacco, as an exemption would be carved out for production of punche for trade with local tribes. And by 1803, punche was being grown throughout the province again. Some 8,000 pesos would be gained from the monopoly overall, but mostly the rich could afford to buy regular tobacco. The monopoly was also often defrauded. The other 2 monopolies, playing cards and gunpowder, also probably provided some revenues to the crown, but overall probably not a huge amount. Stamped papers were also a revenue source for the crown. So essentially how that was supposed to work is you had different grades of stamped paper, which all had different costs, each one having a tax levied on it by the king, which got the stamp, which allowed it to be used. In New Mexico, where paper itself was so scarce, unstamped paper was often used, but a fee would be collected equivalent to having used the correctly stamped paper. There was also a mail service in the Spanish Empire, and in 1766, it went from private to being under the direct control of the treasury. Santa Fe was mostly left out of the greater mail system in the Spanish Empire, and all it had for delivering your mail was a annual caravan that took it to other depots from which it could be more easily spread to wherever it was going in the empire. In 1783, the mail system would finally be extended to the capital of New Mexico, though. To bring this back to the friars again and how they kind of supported themselves, they were paid 330 pesos per year by the crown, and in addition to that, they collected tithes, obventions, and first fruits. Just how extensive tithe collection was in New Mexico is really unclear. It seems like sometimes they were exempt from certain areas from it, and sometimes they weren't. And in 1776, it would be moved to the crown's authority to collect these taxes. Often, they were paid in kind. Obventions, also called stole fees, were a specific kind of fee the priest charged for specific services. The big three being marriage, baptisms, and burials. In New Mexico specifically, the priests would adjust these prices slightly in respect to the person asking for the service's ability to pay. And then finally, first fruits were a portion of the first harvest or product that was being developed by some agricultural process, whether that be a portion of the sheep shearing or a portion of your apricot harvest. New Mexico would be broken into two regions, the Rio Abajo and the Rio Arriba. From there were 6 to 8 jurisdictions, each of which would be run by an alcalde mayor, who would be appointed by the governor. In Santa Fe, they had a cabildo or town council of 4 councilmen that were elected yearly, and they would choose 2 alcaldes and other positions for the area that Santa Fe oversaw. So remember, this cabildo had been established way back at pretty much the founding of Santa Fe and been operating with only small interruptions since. As time went on, the whole system would kind of get really complicated. There were at least 6 different types of alcaldes that would appear throughout the province, and they were also referred to by other titles as well. As far as we're concerned, an alcalde was an alcalde. From the 1740s to the early 1800s, the cabildo would be abolished by the governor, and alcaldes mayor would be appointed instead. Competent alcaldes mayor were hard to find due to the lack of available education in the province, and again, lots of people didn't want to travel to live in New Mexico. Alcaldes could not oversee districts where they had no property, and it was unclear how often this actually happened, though. However, once kind of appointed as an alcalde, it was usually a permanent position, as it's really difficult to find anyone to replace the existing alcaldes, so you tended to keep them. So that would allow them to develop interests in their districts. When given assignments that also had pueblos, the alcalde would usually set up in the largest Spanish settlement in the area. They were also to establish haciendas outside of the main population centers of the area. The alcaldes were often accused of encroaching on pueblo land, and like many Spanish officials throughout the empire, they often abused their positions, including this encroachment on pueblo land, as well as other abuses. Alcaldes were elected sometimes, for instance in 1726, but there was no other real form of municipal government beyond this one official. In 1808, Napoleon would invade Spain, and this would lead to the establishment of the Spanish Cortes in 1810. The Spanish Cortes invited representatives from all throughout the Spanish Empire, including the colonies, and New Mexico would send Pedro Batista Pino by choosing him by lot in 1810, and he would get to leave for Spain in 1811. The big effect of this would be the Constitution of 1812, which, of all the pronouncements it had, the only one that would affect New Mexico under the Spanish would be the formation of ayuntamientos, which were kind of local elected councils. This was the only new ruling that was widely followed in New Mexico, and by 1814, Albuquerque, Belen, Bernalillo, El Paso, Santa Cruz de la Canada, and Santa Fe had all elected ayuntamientos. They would be abolished and brought back during some of the late colonial periods shifting, and we'll kind of talk about all that when we kind of talk about the shift from Spanish colonial to Mexican periods. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with your friends. Leave a review on your podcast app of choice if it lets you. Since I'm a Luddite and don't use social media, word of mouth and reviews are the only way the show spreads. We have a website located at engineeringfire.org. That's spelled engineeringfire.org, where I have a link in the header for podcast resources, including pictures, companion posts, my bibliography, and the transcripts of each show. We have an email you can submit comments and questions to at michael@engineeringfire.org. The intro music is Desperados by Frank Schroeder and sourced from filmmusic.io. The outro music is NeoWestern from Kevin McLeod of Incompetech. Links to all things mentioned are present in the show notes and at the website. Thank you all so much for listening, and I will see you in the next episode.